On behalf of the Arab Center, Washington, D.C., and the Center for Security, Race, and Rights at Rutgers University Law School, I'm pleased to welcome you to this webinar on the new book, Egypt's New Authoritarian Republic. I'm Amy Hawthorne. I'm with the Arab Center, and I will be moderating today's discussion. So, a little more than a decade ago, a turbulent Egypt was at the top of the headlines. Starting in 2011, Egypt experienced many years of turmoil with the January 25th revolution, the election of a Muslim Brotherhood government, an insurgency in the Sinai Peninsula, 2013 military coup, and the rise of strongman leader Abdel Fattah Sisi. Fast forward to today, with the Middle East reeling from the war on Gaza, Israeli attacks on Syria, Lebanon, Iran, Yemen, and remarkably, yesterday, Qatar, Egypt appears as a relative oasis of calm and stability. Yet, even as the world's eyes are not always on Egypt, many important changes have occurred in this country since 2013. Sisi has consolidated his rule and created, as the book's title calls it, a new authoritarian republic. Egypt, of course, remains the region's most populous country with its largest military, a key geographic location, and a significant regional role. And therefore, it remains important to understand what kind of regime and country Egypt is today. And we have an excellent opportunity to do that now, to dig into Sisi's Egypt with this webinar featuring outstanding Egypt experts, including a co-editor of this book and the authors of some of its chapters. And I'm very pleased to introduce our speakers. Bob Springborg is a co-editor of this book, along with Dr. Abdel Fattah al-Mahdi. Bob is non-resident research fellow at the Italian Institute of International Affairs and adjunct professor in the School of International Studies, Simon Fraser University in Vancouver. So, Bob, I'm gathering that you have affiliations to institutions in Rome and Vancouver. That's not a bad deal. Pretty great. Then we have Dr. Nathan Brown. Nathan is a professor of political science and international affairs at George Washington University and a contributor to one of this book's chapters. We have May Darwish. Very pleased to have May with us today. She is Associate Professor of International Relations of the Middle East at the University of Birmingham in the United Kingdom, and she is also a contributor to this edited volume. And last but not least, we have a final speaker who will be joining us in a few minutes. She got held up on her way, and that is Sahar Aziz, who is Distinguished Professor of Law, Chancellor, Social Justice Scholar, and founding director of the Center for Security, Race, and Rights at Rutgers Law School. And as I said, Sahar will be joining us shortly. So each of our esteemed panelists will speak for about 10 minutes, a little bit less. And then following the panelists' remarks, the audience will have chance for about 30 minutes, maybe a little bit more of Q&A with the audience. And audience members, I'd like to let you know that you don't need to wait until the Q&A portion of our program to submit your questions to this morning's speakers. You can send in a question at any time using the Q&A feature in Zoom or by sending an email to events@arabcenterdc.org. So those are two ways to submit questions. And now I'd like to turn to Bob, who has kindly agreed to give us kind of an overview of the book's main themes and arguments and help us understand the title. Why is this a new republic? Because Egypt, of course, has had authoritarian regimes for many decades. So why is the book calling this a new authoritarian republic. And Bob will tell us a little bit about what are the main aspects of Sisi's regime that are different from his predecessors, Mubarak, Sadat, and Nasser. So over to you, Bob, for your kind of overarching remarks about this book. And thank you all so much for joining us today. Over to you, Bob.
Thank you, Amy. A real pleasure to be here. And let me answer your question immediately. It is that we are just imitating the words of the president of Egypt, who claims that he is creating a new republic. Sometimes he calls it the Second Republic, clearly with reference to the Nasserist republic that preceded his, which extended through the Mubarak era. So in this sense, the president has it right. It is indeed a new republic. But before I go on about that subject, I do want to apologize on behalf of Abdel Fattah al-Mahdi, my co-editor, and thank him in front of us all here for the fine work that he did in assembling the contributors to the book, which was a very lengthy process. This book has gestated over almost 5 years. It's the longest procedure of any book I've ever been associated with, and it's been a pleasure throughout, and in part because of Abdel Fattah and his understanding, and in part on the behalf of all of the authors who are with us, of whom there are 11. So it has been an experience, and in that experience, I'd just like to sort of reverse order the thanks of the various people involved in this project, starting with you, Amy, and the Arab Center, and Sahar, and the Rutgers Center for hosting this event. And then an unusual thanks, but one that's very important, which is to Lynn Reiner, publisher. Lynn Reiner is someone who doesn't know how to sit back and just let a book go through the press. No, Lynn is engaged. She, in fact, was the decision maker for the title of this book and was involved in many of the decisions along the way. So she's an absolutely wonderful publisher, and I'm very pleased to be able to work with her. The third, in going in reverse chronological order, party to be thanked is the Arab Center in Doha and its director, Esme Bashara. It was he and that center that almost 5 years ago organized the conference that ultimately led to this book. And it was Abdel Fattah who then took over the burden of converting what were conference papers into the chapters in this book, which were in some cases rewritten 3 times because of the extended delay in producing it. And last, but by no means least, of course, it's the authors who deserve our heartfelt thanks and do indeed have it. And they deserve it in part because 7 of them are living outside of Egypt, not out of their choice, but out of the political necessity imposed upon them by the regime. And so these are people who have a dog in the fight. And the book, I think, reflects the commitment that these people have, as well as the expertise that they accumulated both in Egypt and outside of it, and who maintain very close contact with it. I don't think you would find a group of experts better informed than the authors to this book on Sisi's new authoritarian Egypt. So we owe them all a great debt of gratitude. So what is the book? Well, the book is exactly as Amy introduced it. It's an attempt to understand what this new republic is, how it functions, what are its strengths and weaknesses, and what's its future. How did we go about doing that? We divided it theoretically and structurally into 3 parts. The first part is what is the regime's legitimacy / soft power? And it's a bit unusual to talk about soft power as directed to a domestic audience. Soft power, as Joseph Nye coined the term, related to a regime's ability to project itself on the world stage. But it struck us that the analogy between projecting the image of the country abroad is remarkably appropriate when talking about the current regime in Egypt, this new republic, projecting its power onto its own citizens who do not enjoy full rights of citizenship and in a sense are analogous to foreigners in their own country. And so we can rightfully think then of the idea of the regime projecting its soft power onto its own people to convince them of its right to rule. Now, the legitimation factor is, of course, also relevant. And so the book takes a look in this first 5 chapters of that section at precisely that. It starts with an overview by Imad ad-Din Shaheen, trying to place these things in their relevant perspective. And then Muhammad Afan turns his attention to the ideology of the regime, focused on state and fear. So the loyalty to the state, and Nathan will tell us a bit more about that in his presentation, has been elided with loyalty to the regime. They have become one and the same thing, coupled with fear of the collapse of the state, meaning the removal of the regime as well. It's a very nice exposition of the ideology. Then Bruce Rutherford has dug into the regime's performance in the vital area of educating its population to demonstrate how poorly it has done in that particular public policy area, and what an impact it has in a negative sense on the regime's legitimacy at standing among its own people. Then Muhammad takes up the issue of the relationship between the regime and religion in the form of Al-Azhar's control over it, and sort of nicely describes the functioning relationship that has been struck up between the Sheikh Al-Azhar and the president of Egypt, where a certain amount of institutional autonomy is granted to Al-Azhar in return for Al-Azhar granting the endorsement of the regime in general terms. And then finally, I have a chapter on the economy, which we might come back to later. So those are 5 chapters that try to suggest the regime is seeking legitimacy by projection of soft power, not by interacting with its citizens who have no rights of interaction, but by simply projecting as if they were foreigners rather than Egyptians. The next 3 chapters focus on the hard power of the regime. Abdel Fattah al-Mahdi has the first chapter, which is on civil-military relations. It includes the extent of the military's penetration of the polity and the society, as well as coup-proofing. The second chapter is by Hussam al-Hamalawi. And Hussam, who many of you will be familiar with, who has his own blog, focuses on the Ministry of Interior and the police force and what happened to them in the wake of 2011. And how attempts by the populace to bring to justice the transgressors of the rights of Egyptians in the streets of Cairo and elsewhere in 2011 were in all cases thwarted by the regime, and in the end, even the most egregious abuses of rights and life in the streets and elsewhere were never brought to heel or paid any price for it. The last chapter in this section on hard power is by Walid Salam, who gives us a brilliant update of Tamer Mustafa's treatment of the court system in Egypt under Sadat and Mubarak, and now under Sisi, the relative liberalization of the courts that Tamer Mustafa chronicles so well with regard to Sadat's Egypt in particular, has been rolled back and absolutely systematically, so that it is absolutely rightful to speak now of the Egyptian court system as a fundamental leg of the deep state and of the assertion of hard power. The last section, and I'm very pleased that Maid Darwich is here with us today, who has a chapter in that section, and hers is an attempt to show the relative weakening of Egypt's capacity to project its power into the region, this last section being the foreign relations of Egypt. And as she concludes, since the regime is seeking to legitimate itself in significant measure on the basis of its ability to project that power and defend Egyptian interests abroad, it is doing a poor job in that department. And the last chapter in this section is by Mutaz Fogairi, who takes a look at the exportation, if you will, of the human rights movement of Egypt. Unable to operate in the country itself, it's internationalized and has become part of an international human rights movement. And he chronicles how that occurred and what its impacts are. In the conclusion, Nathan, who's also with us here this morning, does a brilliant job in showing how the difference between ruler, regime, and state has been elided under Sisi, that the ideology of the state has subsumed these other two aspects of the usual treatment of Egypt all in one, so that you are called upon as a citizen to be loyal to the state and by implication, therefore, its ruler and the regime over which he presides. And then finally, I try in a few pages to pull together the soft power legitimacy section, the hard power section, and then the projection of foreign power into sort of a hydraulic model of politics, if you will, that more of one is less of another. And so that as the regime's soft power and legitimacy has stagnated, so has its need to rely on hard power increase. So, Amy, that's the book as a whole. As I said at the outset, was an enormous pleasure working with all of these authors who were really committed to the book. And I will just add at the very end that there's not much competition. And why is there not much competition? Not because there are not plenty of bright people who are interested in Egypt, but because the access into Egypt now for scholars, and we can cite the name of Giulio Regeni, or one of our authors who similarly ended up in detention for the research work he was doing, or the fact that the American Research Center in Egypt no longer sponsors social science research in the country because it is not able to, that there has been a complete closing of the research space in Egypt. And so it's reminiscent of what happened in Lebanon in the wake of the outbreak of the Civil War in 1975. It had been up until that time that Lebanon was a favorite destination for Western researchers. Post 1975, Lebanon became not unknown space, but far less well-known space as the amount of research on the country declined. The same has now happened with regard to Egypt, and it's purposely so. This is not a byproduct. This is one of the fundamental aims of the regime, as I know from the impact on the American Research Center in Egypt, to prevent really thoroughgoing investigations of the country. This book, therefore, written largely by Egyptians who know it from the inside, gives us an insight I think that no other book does. And so I'm very, very proud and pleased to have been associated with it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bob, for that very comprehensive overview. And I appreciate the fact that you mentioned each of the chapters because it really is a remarkable collection of experts and quite an assemblage of knowledge and expertise. Next, I'm going to turn to Nathan to talk about the judges, the rule of law, and the judiciary under Sisi. And Bob mentioned this theme in his remarks. It's clear that the judiciary has been one of the main institutions through which Sisi has created this new republic and consolidated his rule and continues to govern. So there's so many important themes in this book, but the judiciary is a particularly important one. So Nathan, we'd like to turn to you to talk about what has unfolded in this new republic with respect to the role and function of judges and judiciary. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you very much, Amy. Yes, there is something fundamentally new going on. There's authoritarianism is sort of almost a constant element in Egyptian politics, really, for at this point 3/4 of a century. But the form which it is taking is new. But before I describe that, let me just say, Bob ended and began on a fairly somber note about the realities of Egyptian politics and the realities of doing research in Egypt. There was something about this project that was actually encouraging. And that sounds odd. But it made me feel young again, in the sense that Bob and I will probably sort of feel a little bit the same way. We were sort of slogging away for a long time. And one thing that was remarkable about scholarship, a generation ago was, I guess this is a public session, but I hope not to be quoted. Scholarship wasn't all that good. People didn't know that much about Egypt. I mean, they knew certain things about ideology, maybe the organization of the Arab Socialist Union and that sort of thing, about the nature of the regime. But in terms of how politics in the state actually worked, there wasn't an awful lot of interest. We started to work on the judiciary, and the sort of feeling was, why would you study laws? Why would you study courts? That's not really at the center of politics. And there were good reasons for that cynicism, but there were also really revealing things that could be discovered by looking at politics through odd institutions, different social actors, and so on. And that began to happen in research in Egyptian politics. I didn't write one of the chapters on the judiciary. We've got Bruce Rutherford, who was with me towards the beginning of that, who could have written on it but didn't. We have Walid Salam, who actually did write it. He's written a recent excellent dissertation on it. We have a couple other people who were involved in the project who knew something about law and courts and so on. So there's something that's going on in terms of knowledge about Egypt, which, despite the circumstances, I think political analysis about Egypt is just much more sophisticated, and in a sense, it's much more transnational. I mean, Bob mentioned that most of the contributors are Egyptian. Most of them are based in exile. It's not necessarily willingly transnational, but there really is a body of scholarship about Egyptian politics that is sophisticated, and I would say kind of inclusive of different points of view, different methodologies that didn't exist before. So what happens when you turn that new and young and energetic sense of scholarship towards the judiciary? I think you do see something new under this new republic. It's probably covered in most detail in Walid Salam's chapter, but in essence, the judiciary, if you go back to the Nasser period, and Walid mentions this briefly, there was a sense in which the judiciary was usually, for most of it, just left alone. And there's a remark attributed to Gamal Abdel Nasser meeting with some angry judges towards the end of his presidency, in which he is supposed to have said, I did whatever I had to do, but I didn't involve you in it. I wanted to arrest somebody. I wanted to have this shut down. I would do it, but I wouldn't do it through the regular judiciary. You were free to adjudicate, rental disputes, criminal matters, family matters, and so on. And I let you do whatever you wanted to do. And there was a confrontation with him towards the end of the period, which in the Sadat and Mubarak period was reversed. Instead of sort of leaving the judiciary alone, the strategy during that period sort of seemed to be two things. Number one, I guess, sort of a more expanded version of what happened during the Nasser period, a whole set of what Egyptians called exceptional courts. Some of these weren't so exceptional. Some of them were actually part of the standing judicial system. But essentially, there were military courts, there were state security courts. There were ways in which, when the regime wanted to do something, it actually had legal and judicial tools that were separate from the regular system. As far as the regular system, what the regime tended to do was to give it an awful lot of autonomy, as long as it was under reliable hands. So key positions, prosecutor general, for instance, was usually somebody who could be seen as sort of a regime figure, but essentially they were allowed an awful lot of their own perks, higher salaries, and so on, better working conditions. And as long as it was sort of loyal to the fundamental sense of order, not necessarily, there was no real strong regime ideology that they had to parrot or anything like that. And one interesting thing, and here this is my own analysis, intruding on other people's chapters, but what happened in 2011 was an awful lot of those state institutions that had really some autonomy. Some people in them lined up to help overthrow the Mubarak regime or to try and push reform within the judiciary, within the national press, within the educational system, and so forth and so on. So this was something that took place within the state apparatus itself. Okay, 2013 comes. And one of the most remarkable things about 2013 was when the overthrow of the 2012 Constitution and President Morsi was announced. You have this announcement by President, he was not yet president, Minister of Defense Sisi, who is then trying to present himself as representing the entire Egyptian nation. So he reads this address or the speech on television, and behind him are all the pillars of Egyptian society. And pretty much every single one of them, except for the Coptic Pope, is a state official. So this is the powers in each of these state institutions unifying. And what it looked like was perhaps maybe initially a reconvening of the pre 2011 situation in which you had very strong and autonomous state institutions who were fundamentally on the same page, even if they bickered among each other. And that's not what happened. That is not the new republic. And you begin to see signs of this primarily with some early court rulings that really annoyed the regime, perhaps most on Tirana and Senefir. And what I would say is that in the last decade or so, the regime has used two tools to really give it close control over the state apparatus. And this is where, Bob's statement about, regime, ruler, and state becoming much more difficult to distinguish under Sisi than it was before. One tool is just legal appointments. Changing the way in which senior judicial positions are appointed, and if you change senior judicial positions, these people dominate their institutions. And these appointment powers have been used to put reliable people in, and to, for instance, parachute the head of the military courts onto the constitutional court. It has been done to use judges who had been useful or supportive of the regime and appoint them. Most speakers of parliament, both houses of parliament, have been former judges, and so using the judiciary really as a pillar, not simply of order and justice and the state, but of the regime and its policies. And the second thing is behind the scenes. And that is to say that not all state institutions are equal. Most state institutions seem to have somebody within them, or more than one person, who is a liaison to the state security bodies. And what they function almost as commissars. In the sense that major decisions they're there to report on and to report, well, that wouldn't be convenient. And sometimes on some minor issues like permission to host somebody or minor appointments or that sort of thing. So there's a way of monitoring these institutions which doesn't exist on paper and is impossible to trace. But does seem to operate and in ways that I think will be almost impossible to document, but that come up in, it seems to me, often in casual conversations among Egyptians. So this is a new republic. I will leave it to Egyptians to decide whether it's a better one or not, but it's not a very flattering picture to say that there is essentially a very, very strong presidency, a strong president who dominates that presidency, and who, in essence, uses appointment powers, legal tools, and the security apparatus to rein in the kind of autonomy that existed under, I'm not quite sure what I would call it, not the old republic, the middle-aged republic that existed prior to 2011.
Thank you very much, Nathan, for giving us a sense of how Sisi has used the judiciary. Next, we're going to hear from May Darwish, who has contributed a very interesting chapter to this book titled Egypt's Regional Role and the Decline of Regional Power. So right in the name of the chapter there, we have May's thesis, or at least her argument about the decline of regional power, Egypt's regional power. And this is something that we've all observed. Egypt still plays an important regional role and an extremely important role when it comes to particular issues and conflicts, but there is no doubt that its role has changed, and I think many would agree declined. So, May, over to you to tell us about that important topic of Egypt's foreign policy and its regional role.
Thank you, Amy, very much for the introduction, and thank you for having me. It's a pleasure. I also would like to thank Bob and Abdel Fattah for their really significant effort bringing this volume together. I think Bob is quite modest, saying it was a pleasure, but I'm sure it was a pain at many points. And I think Abdel Fattah is not here, but also a personal reflection. I've been very adamant not to work on Egypt and Egypt's foreign policy my whole career. And I think Abdel Fattah pushed me, if not convinced me at some point, that this is significant, it's important. If we don't do this, who's gonna do it? And I think he had a really good point, and I should be grateful that he was actually kind of adamant that I put in a chapter in this volume. And Egypt's foreign policy has been one of the, let's say, case studies in the region that has been studied, but at the very same time, studied from the very same perspective over and over again. And many scholars considered Egyptian foreign policy, especially after 1979, as a case of a country that has no drama in in the foreign policy in general. It's just a continuity of what has been established in the 1970s. And since then, Mubarak has just managed to maintain the main pillars and determinants of its foreign policy. And there's therefore nothing puzzling to study. It's boring and there's nothing new. But in my chapter, I tried to take a different perspective. It's not just about the foreign policy, it's just an assessment of how to understand Egypt's role and position in the region after 2013. And it's very clear that this decline in Egyptian regional leadership has started in the late 1960s, after 1967, and it has been persistent since then, maybe gradual, slow, but definitely persistent. And after 2011, and of course 2013, it became very clear that this decline became a reality. Even many of the decision makers, including Sisi, hinted at this decline and acknowledged it by saying, we vow to return Egypt to its rightful place and to its regional leadership position. And Sisi has repeated this statement over and over in, again, an implicit acknowledgement that Egypt has lost its status and role in the region. Nevertheless, this is not the problem. The problem that I examine in my chapter, that even though most of the objective factors that in Egyptian foreign policy kind of point to this regional decline, we have an elite, an intellectual elite, and a political elite that does not want to acknowledge this decline. Even though Sisi, again, hopefully, or is hopeful to return Egypt to its rightful position, there is no acknowledgement that Egypt's role has changed, and it's no longer recognized by its neighbors, by other actors in the region, as the Arab leader or the leader even in the Nile Basin, for example. So in a way, some sort of a dissonance emerged in the public space, but also in the foreign policy making. On the one hand, there is a new reality in the region. There are challenges coming from all the borders that Egypt shares with its neighbors. But at the same time, Egypt is maintaining a discourse of leadership, does not consider that maybe it is about time to rethink its foreign policy. It is about time to change that role and be a little bit creative about how to deal with this changing environment. So the result of this dissonance is rather some sort of a stagnation in Egyptian foreign policy that we've seen in many of the cases. And in the chapter, I examined two cases with a little bit of details. The case of the GERD, the Grand Ethiopian Dam, where Egypt's power and its ability to influence its neighbor has definitely waned. And it became very clear that Ethiopia has built the dam, filled the dam, despite Egyptian rejections, and definitely making a statement that we no longer fear Egypt. On the other hand, Egypt does not want to change its approach. Still, the discourses are, we're not going to rescind our historical rights in the water. We're not going to change our position. We will dissuade Ethiopia. We will protect our rights. Instead of actually saying, well, this reality has changed, these historical agreements were concluded at a certain historical time, things now are changed. Ethiopia is rising. There is an economic development that's happening in Africa, and we need to change the way we are conducting our foreign policy in this issue. This has not been taken into account. And even when, at the time, some ministers in the very famous meetings of the ministerial meetings discussing the issue of the GERD say, well, let's take a moment to reflect on this. There was an overwhelming attack on them. So you could see here that there was a very strong intellectual elite, but also political elite that was not willing to change that discourse, creating some sort of a stagnation in understanding how to deal with Egypt's new position in the region. The second case study that we are living at the moment, which is the Gaza war and the Arab-Israeli conflict in general, where again, we see that Egypt was a leading power until 1979. It was the mobilizing power militarily against Israel. And then it became isolated for a little bit, but then it became the main mediator and the link between the US, Israel, and Palestine and other Arab countries. In the last decade, again, this has changed. There are new mediators. The US is no longer relying only on Egypt to play that role. And also the Palestinian factions also do not only rely on Egypt in that role. And its role has been challenged by Qatar, by the UAE, by Saudi Arabia in many of these instances. And at the same time, Egypt, again, there is some sort of a rigidity in its position. There is no creativity in reformulating this foreign policy. There is rather a decline, but also at the same time, a maintenance of the very same discourse at the public level. So here, these two cases are just illustrative of a very persistent trend in Egyptian foreign policy since 2013 of a dissonance that existed between the discourse and the actual behavior of Egypt's foreign policy. And somehow this kind of puzzle and a problem is not really unique to the case of Egypt. It's also a case of many of the great powers and regional powers that declined over the centuries. Looking, for example, at the case of Great Britain, a case of a decline in a great power, but at the same time, there is no recognition of this at the public level. The same thing of many other previous historical cases as well, where there is often a big lag between the decline of the power and then the identity and how the political elite recognize this decline. And of course, this kind of lag creates these stagnations, this inability to formulate an effective foreign policy, because from the very beginning, the decision makers are not acknowledging the new realities and the new capacities that are presented to them in these situations. I'm going to stop here. I think I was over the time, but thank you very much, and I'm happy to answer any questions on this.
Thank you so much, May, for those really interesting remarks. And I just jotted down in my notes a few questions that your remarks triggered for me. So hopefully we'll have time to ask those. I'm very pleased to welcome Sahar Aziz, our final speaker. So glad that Sahar has joined us, and I'd like to reintroduce her. Sahar is Distinguished Professor of Law, the Chancellor's Social Justice Scholar, and the founding director of the Center for Security, Race, and Rights at Rutgers University Law School, which is our co-sponsor, the co-host of today's event. So Sahar, it's great to have you with us, and thank you so much for co-hosting this event. Before I turn it over to you for some remarks, I just wanted to remind the audience that you can submit questions through the Zoom Q&A function, or you can send your question in an email to events@arabcenterdc.org. And we've already got some great questions coming in, so I'm really looking forward to the Q&A, but not as much as I'm looking forward to Sahar's remarks. So Sahar, thank you so much, and over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Amy and May and Nathan and Robert. It's nice to see all of you. And thank you to the audience for taking time out of their busy schedules to attend this. And thank you to the Arab Center for co-hosting it. So in case you haven't seen the book physically, I highly recommend it. Egypt's New Authoritarian Republic. I admittedly, I was asked to comment on the book and I hadn't read it yet. So when I saw that it was an edited book, I was a bit cautious, because those of us in the academy know that oftentimes edited volumes can be very disjointed, varying levels of quality in the book. And I found this to be impressively high quality. Every chapter made an intervention and added to my knowledge base. And I think all of us here are quite well versed in the Egyptian context. So thank you to Robert Springborg and Abdel Fattah Ahmedi for co-editing, and to all of the contributors. Admittedly, when I read the book, I had more questions than I had comments, because as I was reading through it, I kept asking myself, what's similar and what's different? Right? Many of us who work on Egypt or research Egypt, admittedly, similar to what May said, we at some point stopped writing about Egypt. And what also Robert said is that one reason is safety issues. The regime has made it very clear that it does not want Egypt to be researched, especially by people who are not living in Egypt, but also even by Egyptian scholars, and has made it very difficult practically to research, and also politically quite risky. Another reason why people in the field didn't research Egypt as much after, I would say, 2015, 2016, is because there was a lot of the same. There wasn't much to say that one wasn't very pessimistic, but also that there hadn't seemed to be that much change. And so I thought, well, first is the fact that this book looks at 10 years is really important, because it does attempt to assess, quote unquote, the Sisi administration, right? The Sisi regime, to see what has he done, whether one would see it favorably or unfavorably, since he has taken office, and it's now, or has taken rule, and now it's been 12 years, right, since 2013. And so the first, I want to kind of divide my comments into three sections. The first is really examining the economic situation and what has happened in Egypt economically under the Sisi regime. Second is governance and electoral politics, and then international relations, which I won't talk too much about, but I do think it's worth mentioning. And I start with economics because, at least from what I have read and observed and researched, the economy right now is what most Egyptians are most concerned about. If you ask them where are their grievances, what's the source of their grievances, it is economic. much of it is due to macroeconomic policies and practices, and then it trickles down to the microeconomic daily experiences. So some of this is covered in the book, so I just want to highlight it. The external debt of Egypt has tripled from $47 billion in 2013 to $165 billion in 2023. The internal debt is now $240 billion. So Egypt is the most indebted it has been, arguably since, I think it was Khedive Ismail in the 1880s. So there are some analysts who are concerned that Egypt, if there were such a thing as colonial receivership in the colonial model, Egypt could be at risk of that. In the current neoliberal capitalist model, it's essentially a loss in sovereignty, which we're seeing in the types of major sales or major decisions about state land that is now being available for purchase by private actors, many of whom are either the Gulf states themselves, their sovereign funds, or it is foreigners from the Gulf or perhaps other countries. So there is a deep concern about the debt, and that has then affected also inflation. And again, I'm not an economist, so I'm not going to I'm not going to make an analysis of the causal factors. I'm just going to state the conclusions, which is that inflation has hovered around 30 to 40% for multiple consecutive years since 2013. There was some inflation from 2011 to 2013, but it wasn't nearly as high as it was in the last 10 to 12 years. So for example, in 2013, the Egyptian pound was £7 to the, £7 to the US dollar. Now it is approximately 49 pounds to the dollar, and there are always concerns that it will go up. So as a result, when you have a major trade deficit, which Egypt has had for a long time, then imports become extremely expensive for Egyptians. And as a result, education has become, those who can afford to put them in the private education, and these are the national education schools, not the international, which have always been exorbitantly high, but the majority of the middle class and those in the lower middle class that could afford to put their kids in private schools, because the public school system has for decades been inferior and has resulted in, I think, out of the 11 years of education that students in public schools are enrolled in, their test scores show that they've really only learned 6.5 years of schooling. So there's 5 years lost, that even though they're technically enrolled. So as a result, they're putting private middle class families have been doing this for decades, and the price of school has tripled from something around £10,000 to now 35,000, 40,000 pounds per year per child. So you have a large number of middle-class families who simply can no longer send their kids to private schools, which means that they now are risking children who barely learn anything in the public school system, where you have 50 students per classroom. The other kind of component of this at the macro level is, I think it would be accurate to describe Sisi as kind of a continuation of what Sadat did, which was the economic neoliberalization of the economy, transition from the socialist system to the neoliberal capitalist system. However, one could argue it's on steroids. All right, so we're seeing a lot of hot money in Egypt, which is money that comes, invests really quickly in the stock market, and then gets out when things go bad or when it chooses, which can affect the foreign currency, which affects imports, affects inflation, and so on and so forth. But what you're seeing is shrinkage of the civil service, so that's less jobs for middle-class Egyptians, and this going to the privatization model at a very, very fast rate. So one question that I have for the panelists, for those who would like to comment on this, is what do they predict will be the impact on ruler succession due to these economic problems? Because food is more expensive. Now Egyptians are finding themselves renting a lot more because they simply no longer have the intergenerational wealth that would allow families to start saving for their sons, in particular, for an apartment once they got married. They would start as soon as they were born. And so in order to be married, to have a comfortable life starting out your marriage, is you would have your parents save up your entire life and buy you an apartment, and that would give you middle class status. And that was often culturally the obligation of the groom. That is no longer economically possible except for the very elite. So they're starting to rent, and rents are going up. And we're seeing a lot of the housing crisis problems we see in the US, where people cannot afford to rent, and unemployment is high, and salaries are low, have not kept up with inflation. So this is really what's on everybody's mind if you ask just the average Egyptian. And so I would be interested in hearing from our panelists what they think, how that's going to affect the success, regime succession. With regard to, and I just wanted to emphasize something that was really interesting in one of the chapters, is that one of the authors is arguing that Sisi is attempting to adopt China's emphasis on improving the material well-being of Egyptians rather than strengthen civil and political rights. So he's very intentional and very explicit in trying to marginalize, if outright outlaw, if he could, civil and political rights, which many of us are familiar with from the news reporting over the last 12, 13 years. However, he has tried to kind of sell his legitimacy through what one of the authors calls performance legitimacy. I'm going to improve your material well-being. I'm going to improve the economy. And his regime has built a lot of roads and a lot of bridges and has improved. It has improved traffic. However, given everything else that people are unable to pay for, basic goods, especially among the middle class, lower middle class, and the rising poverty level that some estimate is as high as 60%. So the low range is 35% of Egyptians are under the poverty rate, which is higher than under Mubarak. And some will say, no, it's actually reached 60%. So if Sisi is in fact emphasizing this model of improving material well-being, has this model, has it worked in other authoritarian states? And arguably, if you look at the facts, it's certainly not working in terms of delivery of material well-being. With regard to governance and electoral politics, I think the main takeaway, which again is no secret, is that the military has certainly gone from ruling to governing. Right? They've gone from behind the curtain influence, which arguably was decreasing under the Mubarak years, especially in the 90s and in the early 2000s, whereas the internal security services had significantly more power within the regime. And that changed after 2013. And what you're seeing is former military generals who are appointed as governors, former military generals who are appointed as CEOs of any state-owned enterprises that are left, or any major contracts that the military has some influence in, or that are state controlled in some way, even if partially. And the military has a huge chunk of the economy, which has squeezed out parts of the private sector, which again has caused more economic grievances because factories have been shutting down. Although, the formal policy is that he is trying to increase production and increase exportation. But the problem is this tension between the military desiring to have more control over the economy as part of its larger governance role, while also wanting free market under the neoliberal capitalist state. And I'm sure Professor Brown can talk about this because he's written quite a bit, is essentially how does the military rule through an authoritarian system through clientelism, right? And rent seeking to pay off, or through a patronage system, because now the primary internal patrons are within the military and former military generals. So I would be interested in hearing more about that, the role of the military in governance. And then finally, because I know I'm running out of time, I think we do need to keep, this is kind of for future analysis because things are changing rapidly, as May discussed, is there is certainly, I think, a crisis in Egypt's role in the region because of so many different changes, the rise of Saudi Arabia, the rise of, in regional politics, and being kind of the desired hegemon who is competing with Iran, the rise of Israel. I mean, the fact that Israel has just bombed, I think, 5 or 6 Arab countries, just bombed Qatar yesterday in Doha, which is a violation of international law because it was essentially a targeted assassination. Bombed Yemen, bombed Iran, bombed Syria, bombed Lebanon, and also many international scholars, including Holocaust and genocide scholars who are Jewish American or Jewish European or even Jewish Israeli, have argued that what they're doing, what Israel's doing in Gaza, is a genocide. So the regional politics has changed significantly since Egypt was the kind of premier regional hegemon, or at least one of the hegemons. And so when you combine it with its economic problems and its economic vulnerabilities, especially at the macroeconomic level, one must ask, what is the future of Egypt's role in the region in international relations, and how will that impact Egypt? Right? Not just the region, but Egypt and Egyptians in the future. And I think that is an open question, but you cannot connect the economics from the governance, military governance in particular, and the international relations and the changes in the region. So I will end there. I hope that I provoked more questions than answered them. You know, it's very difficult to comment on such a rich book, but I would recommend everyone read it, and hopefully this conversation triggers more interest in Egypt, because I do think that it is a country that warrants academic research, if only to inform American foreign policy.
Thank you very much, Sahar. And now we're going to begin the Q&A portion of our program, and we have really so many excellent questions that have come in from the audience. I don't know if we will have time to get to them, and I'm going to attempt to combine some of the questions that are on similar topics and themes. The first kind of theme set of questions I'd like to pose to Bob, and it has to do with Sisi's management of the economy, which Sahar just spoke about. But if you could go into a little more depth, the title of your chapter in the book is Legitimacy Without Economic Growth, which is a very interesting title because, as we recall, when Sisi came to power, a significant part of his discourse to the Egyptian people and to the international community to gain legitimacy for the military coup was that he was going to significantly improve Egypt's economy. That was one of his main promises. And as we know, that has not happened. The economy, the economic conditions in Egypt for the vast majority of people have gotten significantly worse. So, Bob, could you talk about Sisi's management of the economy? And to fold in a couple of audience questions, one audience member asks, why do the Gulf states keep coming in and providing these huge aid and investment packages that kind of help to save Egypt's economy? For how long are the Gulf states going to continue doing this? And is Egypt too big to fail? And another audience member asks, how much more misery can the Egyptian people endure before they explode again against the regime? And economic misery is foremost in so many people's minds in Egypt today. So if you'd like to take kind of that set of questions, Bob, and kick us off in just a few minutes, and talk about how you see this economic situation under Sisi.
Sounds like a new book you want, Amy. A new book. Let me draw upon my and Sahar's comments and try to apply them more directly to the economy. And Maya's analysis of foreign policy was essentially that the regime keeps beating its head against the same wall, that its ability to project power into the Horn of Africa or even across the Sinai and the Gaza has been reduced to very little indeed. Well, it's the same problem with the economy. They keep doing the same thing. They keep hitting their head against that wall without changing it. And so it's very much analogous also to Lebanon, which was in a Ponzi scheme for a couple of decades. And it would go through the same cycle time and time again. Namely, it would be bailed out. It would then reduce the inflation rate, therefore reducing the threat of a devaluation. So the hot money would flow in. And then as the servicing the debt and underperformance of the economy required further borrowing, at a certain point, those providing the hot money would tire of it and be frightened that their resources are going to be devalued. And so they pull it out. And that's precisely what Egypt has been doing now under Sisi time and time again, with the guarantees provided basically by the IMF, the bank, and behind them, the Western powers, and increasingly directly by the European Union and consistently by the Gulf Cooperation Council states. It is a huge Ponzi scheme and remains as such. And the evidence of that I can go through. But first, I want to go to Sahar's point here about, well, and the questioner about, well, how much more can people endure? I think the sad answer is they're going to be forced to endure a lot more. One of the reasons why is ideological. The fundamental ideology of the Sisi regime, like that of, interestingly enough, Benito Mussolini in fascist Italy, was that the problems of the country are due to the slackness of the people. That the real problem is we need to remake the Egyptian, or in the case of Mussolini, the Italian man. And so if you're poor, you deserve it, is the sort of the subtext of that ideological message. And Sisi has repeated this time and time again. So in a sense, what he's done is cast aspersions on his own country people and divide them. So the poverty-stricken can be looked upon as inviting their own fates. And who should feel sorry for them? And I think part of this is a very, very purposeful strategy of dividing the Egyptian body politic, of pulling the upper middle class rather, away from the lower middle and lower classes, and treating them with contempt. And so there's the ideological dam, if you will, that's been built up against the overflow of contempt pouring into the streets, as it did back in 2011. The other thing, of course, is the hard power, the second section of the book. And this hard power, to take a look, for example, at Hussam al-Hamalawi's chapter, has been really profoundly institutionalized within not just the Ministry of Defense, as it's called, maybe it'll be renamed the Ministry of War in light of the Sisi, in light of Trump's changes, but it's also gone into the Central Security Force. It's gone into general intelligence. They have been militarized. They have built up a capacity far beyond what the Central Security Force had when it was originally created, Nasser Sadat era. Now they have become sort of counterterrorism forces with heavy weaponry and so on. They are directed entirely against the domestic population. So for ideological and coercive reasons, it's hard to imagine how potential uprisings would succeed in any meaningful way. They are going to meet overwhelming force. And moreover, there is not a sort of broad-based coalition that one can see emerging that would include the very people who were in Meydan al-Tahrir back in 2011 and poor people in, let's say, Bulat or wherever, who would join hands together. I think that's quite unlikely. Now, as far as this, the consequence of the Ponzi scheme, just very quickly here about the economy, the real measure of its failure is not only, as Sahar said, the poverty rates, which, you know, she went from 30 to 60. The latest figure I've seen on the estimated, the government has not released poverty figures since 2021. So it's all very speculative. Those who speculate come up with different figures. Right now, last one I saw was about 37%, which is huge. It's never been as high as that. So you have poverty. What you have beyond a doubt is failure of investment and savings. Very, very low investment and savings rate in Egypt. As a result, the economy continues to rest almost entirely on the four pillars that were established during the Nasser era: hydrocarbons and their derivatives, remittances, tourism, and Suez Canal revenues. And what's critical about those four sources is, one, they are not large generators of personal savings and jobs, with the exception of tourism. But tourism you cannot grow the productivity of tourism. It is not subject to productivity increases. So you're not going to enhance GDP per capita, basically, through any sort of investments in tourism. Moreover, they're enormously cyclical, as we see now with the Suez Canal and the interdiction of shipping in the Red Sea. The same is true now with the hydrocarbon downstream industries, that Egypt is now importing, signed a deal of 35 billion with Israel to import gas from Israel. So the idea of cheap energy fueling the fertilizer, chemical, and other energy intensive industries is long gone. And that's why the Gulf folks who used to invest in those, as did Europeans, are now going to real estate. Because the energy intensive industries are no longer profitable in Egypt, at least as profitable as they used to be. In short, the four pillars are insufficient to build an economy that can support the current population of 108 million Egyptians. And so it has failed. But the walls against the people rising up against this failed political economy are so profound ideologically and instrumentally that I just hate to think of the consequences of very significant uprisings. I think they would be very bloody indeed.
Can I just add to something that that Robert said? So I think, because I didn't address this in my comments, but I wanted to, I think I agree with you with regard to the possibility of a revolution, or impossibility. For one reason is the people who lived through the failure of the revolution are still alive, and they have lost faith in the ability of a peaceful revolution to actually improve their life and to bring out democracy. So as long as they're alive, I suspect, or I predict, that they will be much more hesitant to go out and do it again. Second is they saw the economic problems that came with it, and ultimately a military coup that brought in a military general and military control. But also, I think they gave up that on the hope that the political and civil rights is what is going to make them live a better life. And they are willing to accept this deal that Sisi is offering, but he's not meeting his end of the bargain, which is, if you give us materially better life, then we can. I think there are more Egyptians now, certainly than in 2011, who say, fine, we'll make that deal. The problem is he's not meeting that deal. So that leads to the question of what will happen as the economic malaise increases, because Egyptians are becoming increasingly in debt, which was not as common. They're borrowing money. And in Egypt, the law punishes someone who cannot pay their debt by going to jail. So you're seeing more Egyptians going to jail because they cannot pay their debts, their monthly debts. They're borrowing for cars. They're borrowing for school, to put their kids in school. They're borrowing to pay their rent, right? They're borrowing for basic necessities. And if they can't pay it back because they lose their jobs or they overborrow, they end up in jail. Finally is, my prediction is that if there is a non-peaceful succession, or one that is not voluntarily conducted by Sisi, that the more likelihood is a coup. And I think that's why you're seeing so much counterintelligence within the military. You're seeing a rapid change of positions in higher positions by Sisi, because I think he's quite aware of that. And one of the reasons why you might also have a coup is the reputation of the military has plummeted. If you remember, during the revolution, the military had the highest reputation of all state institutions. Arguably, Nathan and I might say the judiciary had a decent reputation, but the military now, because it is governing so openly, I think that is the Egyptians no longer believe in it, that it can be the savior of the country, or the protector of the country, in the same way they did in 2011 and 2013.
Thank you, Bob and Sahar, for some very profound and thought-provoking remarks. I'd like to turn to May with a question that spans both domestic issues and foreign policy. And this has to do with the issue of water scarcity and the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, or GERD, stopping that dam from going online has been, and sort of challenging Ethiopia has been an important focus of Sisi's foreign policy, an area in which I think we could say he has not succeeded. How do you see Sisi dealing with the water scarcity issue in Egypt? And in particular, how do you see him dealing with the issue of the GERD going forward. And one audience member asks, is Sisi's ambition to join the BRICS, is that really only motivated by his desire to sort of counter the influence of Ethiopia? Thanks so much, May. Over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Amy, and thanks to the audience for these questions and to Sahar for some very insightful comments. I think the issue with the GERD is not definitely the making of Sisi's presidency, but it fell upon him to actually endure its consequences. So it has started since Sadat, actually. Ethiopia had the intention and the plans to build that dam since the 1970s. And Egypt, under Sadat, but also during the Mubarak presidencies, have managed to deter Ethiopia from starting the buildup of the dam. After the revolution, just a couple of weeks, taking advantage of the chaos and the vacuum of power that happened in Egypt, Ethiopia took the decision to build the dam. And then the whole thing started with these rounds of negotiation that kept feigning one after the other. One of the major, let's say, factors that contributed to that failure was the overconfidence of the Egyptian decision makers that they could stop this. And they didn't really realize that after 2011 and after the transition leading to 2013, things have changed. The neighbors around Egypt do not see Egypt as a deterring power as it used to be. It's not as it's not as strong as it was perceived before, but also at the same time, Ethiopia was on the rise. And one way could have been to resolve this is by Egypt to acknowledge that this is a changing situation and we need to deal with this, and we need to sit with Ethiopia, acknowledge that times are changing, and let's discuss how to do this, and let's do it together. I think from the Egyptian, and I think as an Egyptian, and many of my colleagues also acknowledge this fact, there was extreme arrogance and there was rejection of whatever was put forward by Ethiopia and other African countries to get to a compromise on this issue. Of course, this issue again was inherited from colonial times, but there should have been a way to resolve it. Now there is no way of resolve it. The dam is filled. Egypt is more or less have to live with it. The problem is not happening every year. The problem is going to happen when there are droughts. And these are let's say, the situation where often the negotiation failed when they were discussed. So, okay, the dam is there will be a share of water, but what is going to happen to the share if the water is enough? If some of the years there is not enough rain, there is not enough water, what is the share? And there, Egypt said, no, I need my share. I'm not going to give it up. And Ethiopia said, no, we cannot do this. We have to discuss how to deal with this situation. But it was somehow a point where often the negotiation stopped because they could not really reach a point of compromise. And that is going somehow to be what Egypt has to deal with. If there are droughts, Egypt will be left without enough water. There needs to be some thinking around using underground water, shifting some of the habits of the Egyptian households, shifting some of the economic policies around water resources. My fear is that there's not enough long-term thinking and planning in the Egyptian bureaucracy and in the Egyptian state in general. And there's often, rather than a crisis management approach, it's dealing with the crisis after it happens. And okay, what can we do about it? And I think this is going to be somehow what we're going to see in the future with these kind of problems. Egypt, to balance this, I don't think the BRIC was part of that strategy. I think the BRIC was rather to escape some of Egyptian debts and make benefit of some of the economic trade agreements that are around the BRIC. I don't think it was necessarily related to the GERD, but what was related to the GERD was Egypt strengthening its alliance with Ethiopia, with Somalia and other countries in East Africa in order to encircle Ethiopia by sending some of the troops to Somalia, by trying to strengthen its relationship with some of the African countries. Unfortunately, again, it's done in a very cosmetic way rather than an organic way to foster a real cooperation that would benefit Egypt as well as other African countries on the longer term. So I hope that wasn't too pessimistic, but it is a bad situation.
Thank you. Thank you so much, May. One of our audience members has posed an interesting question about the role of the media. What role is the media playing in Sisi's regime with respect to both soft and hard power? The audience member asks. Nathan or Sahar, would you like to speak for a few minutes about that? Nathan?
Yeah, sure. It's a different media scene, and a lot of our discussion has been, if Egypt's always been authoritarian, what's new about this? What's new about this version? And to me, there is a difference from, say, the early 21st century or from the Nasser period and so on. And I'll use an analogy to what I said about this book. There may be all sorts of depressing things going on in Egypt, but there's all kinds of great intellectual discussion. And that was the Egypt of the early 21st century. It was a remarkably lively media scene, and that was true with old media, like print media. You had this flourishing independent press, independently owned press. You had a real thorough professionalization of the press.
Well, Nathan, you seem to have frozen. I think we're going to wait until that untangles itself and come back to you to finish your remarks on the media. In the meantime, let me pose another question to May. Sorry, May, to put you on the spot, but there's a lot of interest in foreign policy. And the question is,
I'm sorry, I wanted to intervene before you move to the next question about just the media really quick.
sure.
Because I think that this is, there are two points of analysis I would recommend, and I'm interested to hear what Robert has to say, and May and Nathan. One is the way in which what we call long-term versus short-term authoritarians, when authoritarians believe that they have a long lifespan, they tend to behave differently than when they have a short time span, which sometimes explains why Mubarak behaved in a certain way when he first came into office versus later in office. And so when you look at the media, that is also impacted. And what he did immediately, and that again, it was very clear in the news reporting, is that he started to shut down. And he started to shut down that existed, and he also started to censor heavily the state media, which has always been censored, but even eliminated any of that. But what we're seeing is that the boundaries of speech has shrunk significantly. So there was always, as Nathan said, what's out of bounds and what's in bounds. And, if you want to be charitable to Mubarak, what was out of bounds was his family, right? Anything about his family, anything about regime change or removing him. But as long as you didn't touch his kind of security as a dictator formally, there was more space, and it would ebb and flow depending on the domestic politics. Now what you're finding is a very, 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 even, I don't know if Nathan thinks there's even any space, but it has shrunk significantly such that Egyptians are even more cynical of reading their own media. They were already cynical. Right? The joke is in January 25th of 2011, there was a revolution happening in Tahrir, and the state media was showing sailboats on the Nile in this with peaceful music, right? So that kind of gives you an idea of state media never having accurate representation. So I do think that we should have very, very low expectations of any type of robust debate in media. And they've also banned all the media that comes from abroad. So Middle East Eye, even Medium, which is a blog, many sources that are from Europe or from Turkey or from the US, just ban them. You can't even access them unless you can find a way around it through a VPN or some other source. So they don't, and these are English. So imagine the Arabic. All right. So they're clearly, it's very intentional that they want to keep the population as isolated as possible from information that they find is favorable to the regime.
Thank you so much, Sahar. We have Nathan back. Nathan, I'm so happy to have you back with us after a slight technical difficulty. Would you like to just say a few words about the media that you under Sisi you were starting to speak about before we lost you? Thank you.
Yes. So I was all here the whole time. I don't know where all of you went, but I'll pick up. I don't know what I said that was heard, but I'll pick up just to amplify a couple things about what I heard from Sahar. One is, if you look at print media today in Egypt, it is absolutely striking. It's not just boring. It is boring in the exact same words with the exact same photos. The state-owned press is press releases, quite literally. And not just a state-owned press, even privately owned press. I mean, the privately owned press is owned by the intelligence services and so forth and so on. So that is remarkable. But I also want to tie to some of the earlier discussion about possibilities for mass protest. What happened in 2011 was remarkable in the sense that it was unexpected, but the agendas that people had were not unexpected. There had been open intellectual discussion about how Egypt could be governed better. There was a lot of consensus. There was a lot of disagreement. People didn't understand how deep some of those disagreements were over some things, over economics, over religion, and so forth and so on. But on January 25th, there were clear slogans, and by February 11th, there were programs. I mean, people were out and ready to do politics, and that's gone. It is just gone. And when I speak to Egyptians today, they're maybe frustrated by some of the things we're talking about. They're resigned, they're accepting, whatever. But this is a society in which there is not really much of a public sphere to discuss politics. People discuss it privately, actually, in my experience, very, very openly. But the minute you have any kind of public record of discussions, even on social media, it is fairly sharply watched and controlled. And the implications of that could be, I think, potentially dangerous, because in a sense, political grievances are not coupled anymore to political programs, political demands, and political instability in Egypt, I think, could take very different kinds of inchoate forms that are going to be very, very difficult for various actors to manage and negotiate.
Thank you, Nathan. May, I'd like to turn back to you for a few minutes before I pose a final question to all of our speakers in the few minutes we have left. And May, if you would, this is the question that I was starting to ask you before, which is, why does Egypt remain a trusted mediator why does it remain on the global stage a trusted mediator for Israel and for the Palestinians and for other Arab countries? This is one particular role in its foreign policy that Egypt continues to play. That has changed, but it hasn't disappeared. Why do you think Egypt is still able to play that mediating role, and do you see it as a trusted mediator still?
No, it's not a trusted mediator, at least from the Palestinian factions. And I think this has shifted over time. At the very beginning, it was perceived as a trusted mediator because, one, it was the only country that had formal relationship with Israel and the US until maybe 91 after the Oslo Accords and the Jordanian-Israeli peace treaty. But until then, Egypt was more or less the only country that could actually speak openly to these actors. And it has been a supporter of the Palestinian cause for a very long time. So it was perceived by the Palestinian factions as a supporter. And for a very long time, it could play this role and be seen as an actor that has no interest to be on the side of one or the other, and has an interest in maintaining the peace and stability. At the very end of the Mubarak period, this has changed a little bit, especially when Omar Suleiman was the head of the security service, where it has become more recurrent that the Mubarak regime was pressuring the Palestinian factions to accept some of the concessions asked by the Israeli government. And here there was some break of trust. And it was very clear that the regime in Egypt is increasingly seen standing on the side of the Israeli government. After 2013, this perception has been consolidated, and there has been many discussions of how the Sisi regime has received a lot of support from Israel for survival in the last 10 years, either economically, diplomatically, and politically. And it's become increasingly visible, especially on the Palestinian side, that the Sisi regime is not anymore, let's say, an unbiased actor in these mediations. Sisi has kind of taken very strong positions against Hamas, destroyed the tunnels in between Gaza and Sinai, and has taken many policies that were more or less seen as harming the Palestinian resistance over time. With the outbreak of the Gaza war, again, it became clear that Egypt has to be involved, because it has been involved all along. It has the knowledge, it has the contacts, it has the capacity to play that role of mediator, but it's not a trusted actor. Hamas have often required the presence of Qatar in every round of negotiation because they don't trust the Egyptian. Israel as well has undermined the Egyptian role repeatedly. It has to be there because of geographic requirements. I think sadly for the Palestinian, Egypt is on their borders, so they had to deal with Egypt. But otherwise, we would have seen Egypt's role declining even more. And I think it will remain involved because of this geographic proximity. It cannot be ignored. The issue is on its border, but there's definitely a decline. There's definitely a disregard for Egypt's role from all parties involved, including the US. There's a lack of respect by all actors, and there's also a recognition that Egypt is no longer a regional leader.
Thank you, May. That's very interesting comments, especially thinking about how things may or may not shift after yesterday's attack on the Hamas negotiators in Doha, and whether Qatar will continue to play a role or Egypt will take on a bigger role, or we'll see. So we are basically at the end of time. I'm sorry that I didn't get to field any more of our excellent audience questions, but I think we've managed to cover a lot of thematic and topical ground in this conversation. It's been a pleasure to have all of you with us to discuss this excellent book, which I really would like to recommend. And I very much agree with what Sahar Aziz said, that it is a very coherent edited volume. And so it's really a pleasure to read as a whole and the individual chapters. So thank you again to Bob, co-editor and contributor of the book, Bob Springborg, and also thank you to your co-editor, Dr. Abdel Fattah Mahdi. Thank you so much to May Darwish for giving us so many excellent insights on Egypt's changing regional role. And thank you to Nathan for telling us about the judiciary under Sisi, but also touching on questions about the media and about sort of the future of Egypt's politics. On behalf of Arab Center Washington and our co-host for today, the Center for Security, Race, and Rights at Rutgers University Law School, I'd like to thank you all so much for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you at another event soon. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.